25 to 50 years of badgering teacher ed and all of the argument about what teachers need to know and be able to do, who's the best one to teach them how to know and be able to do it, under what circumstances, under what kind of, when you put all of this in there, there's some things that become really clear. One is, there is no way on this green earth that you can possibly prepare a person to be broadly educated as a teacher needs to be trained in the kind of skills and competencies that you need, and yet to have that overall educated person perspective that enables them to function the way professional teachers should. So the whole question of ethics and the ethical dimension of the decisions that teachers make and teacher leaders make is something that most of us probably get the hard way, or we get through osmosis. We don't get it by reflectively thinking about it, analyzing it, working on it. The second piece is that when you look at what has always been core to being a teacher, what it means to be an educator, there is a strong moral dimension. There's a strong moral dimension. Now, you may want to not say we're talking about moral dimensions, but when you talk about ethics, you're obviously talking about moral dimensions of teaching, teacher behavior as it affects students and their learning. So one of the things that is embedded in the ethical decisions in the cases that we might use is drawing out the moral dimensions of teaching, which is really, really critical. Now, somewhere along the way, we may want to think about some of the things we ask students to read that they begin to look for. There are what? I don't know, I've lost count. I mean, you've got the obvious, you've got the NEA, you've got principles of teaching, you've got ethics as they come, or you've got what? Ethics of teaching or moral behavior, whatever you've got it in accreditation. So you could even, you've got 4 or 5 different sets of ethical codes of conduct, principles, whatever. And they're broad-based. I mean, they direct you to things you ought to think about. But somehow when you read them, you don't sit down and think about that kid that just cheated on a test and you know it, and you know a whole lot about him, and you know the circumstances in his life that make you sympathetic of the situation he's in and the pressures he's under. And now you're trying to decide what to do, and you know that one decision you could make could totally close the door for him in terms of college scholarships if you do X versus Y. There's nowhere, there really is nowhere in the education of teachers, the education or the training of teachers, there's nowhere that really causes you to have to stop and reflect. So, yes! Go away, dog. That wasn't ethical, was it?
That's okay. That's good.
He's a sweet dog. But somehow out of this, I think when you think through some of the different kind of cases that you might experience, you're going to immediately realize that when you have to think them through and weigh what the moral dimensions are in making your decisions of what's best for that student and what's right for you as a professional, you really are becoming a professional. And there's a difference between professional, and professionalization.
Yes.
And we're talking about you as a professional and the behavior you model as a leader and the ways in which you can somehow translate that to other teachers. So I think, you know, the 2 books and the cases in them give you something to put your hands around and get a sense of it. But embedded under all of this is, what is it these days? They talk about ethics for business.
Yes.
They talk about ethics for medicine. They talk about ethics for drugs. They talk about ethics for everything. And that's bottom line for the profession.
Excellent. I will tell you that just this morning I read the NEA standards, ethical standards, and it's all very clinical. It's all very black and white. You read the first one, you say, well, of course. And you read the second one and you say, sure, well, of course. And they broke it down into 2 categories: ethical behavior for teachers or with students, and then among colleagues and within the school setting and so forth. And there's not a single one on there that you would argue with. And you're like, well, this is very well thought out. This is very clinical. I don't know if Kentucky has ethical standards set for teachers. I did find several other states and actually set up a website for us that links to several resources that teachers could use. One of the things that I find strong about the ethical leadership and decision-making in education book is this concept of the hidden curriculum. Mm-hmm. And I think so many times when school systems come to us for professional development, they ask for one thing, which is typically it's standards and it's how-tos and it's strategies. They'll go a lot to strategies, not with all of us thinking that, well, if people just teach the right way, it takes care of everything. And the truth of the matter it does not.
What is right way?
Well, let's say this. If teachers teach according to what research tells us is best practice. So if we go out and do professional development and we're talking about best practice, in my discipline, best practice in literacy, and I can share that all day long, but the hidden curriculum at the school can pull the rug out or actually prevent a firm baseline from being in place to build that on. You know, so I think this is so important.
Something you said that really triggers for me. What research says about best practice. One of the things that a recent issue in Journal of Teacher Education commented on was the concern about preparing teachers and the curriculum for preparing teachers becoming so focused on the skills, the competencies, the knowledge base, that somehow that ethical, moral dimension that frames how you apply them is missing. In fact, it talked about foundations of education being missing in some ways. If you take that one step further and you look at what research says about best practice works so long as the situational variables hold true. And when you're dealing with human beings, when you're dealing with kids, and they are so different, teachers always have to bring situational variables to bear. That doesn't mean you make decisions that are unethical, but it means, is it ethical to make a decision devoid of the situational variables that are unique to that individual in that time and place? And that's always different.
It is always different, and I think it's very much like our medical profession. You know, best practice, what we do in medicine is what we know right now. Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean that it's the be-all and the end-all, mm-hmm. that as we learn more about the human body and more about the scientific aspects of it, it doesn't mean that we won't change that. And, you know, at one time leeches were the rage. So it's not like anyone's ever done, and I think education is very much like that as well. And while there's so many ethical dilemmas in medicine, and especially in our current day where we're having to weigh the economics of treatment.
That's right.
And whether or not someone can really afford the treatment that they need, who should get it, who should pay for it, is it a common right among all, or is it something that if you can afford it, you can have it, and if you can't, you can't. And those kinds of things people like to make very black and white, very much like the child who cheats.
That's right.
The policy of the school, the way it's written, is one guideline. And if you don't think beyond that, if you're just reading the black and white on the page, the scenario you gave us earlier doesn't give that child any wiggle room.
Oh. If you come back again to what is it, if you had to look at one single purpose above all others, that drives you as a teacher in the profession, it has to come back down to the student.
Yes.
What's best for the student in terms of developing them holistically and their learning capacities. But it's that holistic piece that goes with learning that complicates it when it comes to ethical decisions. So, wow.
Okay.
I think...
But for right now, let us talk